Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. Today's guest has an extraordinary tale to tell, because at this time of the rolling year she vividly remembers the pivotal role that she played with Philip Mould in bringing back to London an incredible portrait, painted in 1843 of a 31-year-old Charles Dickens on the brink of either roaring success or crushing failure. Dickens was writing Martin Chuzzlewit when he sat for this painting, and it wasn't going well. On top of that, he'd just decided to start working on a ghostly little book for Christmas. His publishers weren't impressed with this idea, but he pressed on regardless, and what he published on the 19th of December that year would change his reputation, fortunes, and legacy as a writer forever. This portrait, painted by Margaret Gillies, who incidentally absolutely deserves her own episode, captures what our guest describes as the knife-edge moment, where Dickens's bright expression betrays an anxiety about his future, and whether, like Scrooge, he will be able to change the course of his life. Sometime after this portrait was displayed at London's Royal Academy in 1844, it disappeared and was truly lost for 130 years, until 6 years ago when it surfaced at auction in South Africa in a tray stuffed with some truly worthless objects and in very poor condition. So this is the story of how a painting was recalled to life and even saved from deliberate destruction. How it travelled over 7,500 miles from South Africa to where it now hangs above Dickens's writing desk at the Charles Dickens Museum in Doughty Street. And sharing this story with us is the inimitable Emma Rutherford, who is an art historian with a specialisation in portrait, miniatures and silhouettes. Emma began her career at London's Victoria and Albert Museum, and then for 15 years established and ran the Portrait and Miniatures Consultancy at Philip Moulds & Co. And this year she has set up the Limner Company. Her publications include Without Hands, The Art of Sarah Biffin, and I think I might have persuaded her to come back and talk to us about that next year. Fingers crossed. It's now time to meet Emma. Emma, hello. Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for asking me to come on and talk to you.
Well, I'm really thrilled you're here because you're going to talk about the so-called lost portrait of Charles Dickens, which you told me when we were speaking in the run-up to this, is something that you tend to think about quite a lot at this time of year. Could you explain to us a little bit about that and why that is?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the lost portrait was painted during the time that Dickens was writing Christmas Carol. And so the whole thing for me is totally bound up with Christmas, and we launched the portrait to the public at Christmas, having kept it a secret for ourselves for a year as well. So this time of year I always think about Dickens and Christmas Carol, and it almost does to me what Christmas Carol I think did to the public when it was published. It sort of slightly brings me to my senses about Christmas, and I stop complaining and I try and be a bit more charitable, and so it really is still having an effect on me. But yeah, the portrait itself is very much bound up with Dickens and that absolute moment in his career, very short moment where he's writing Christmas Carol. So of course it's absolutely totally connected.
Yeah, gosh. And how did you first hear about the portrait? And then how on earth did you manage to keep it to yourself for a year?
Yeah. Well, part of how I kept it to myself for so long was because I didn't get to see it in person for about 6 months after I received an email about it. So I didn't physically have the portrait for quite a long time, which is a bit of a tale in itself. But I received an email. I was consulting for the Philip Mould Gallery. I was there for 15 years. I've only just had a year now of working on my own as a dealer, but I was working for Philip Mould at the time, and he has this very well-known BBC programme with Fiona Bruce called Fake or Fortune. And it meant that lots of people would write in speculatively with portraits, hoping that this sort of grotty thing in Granny's attic was going to be a fortune and not a fake. And there was this delightful man in South Africa who kept sending me pictures of miniatures, knowing that that was my specialist area. And most of the time I was writing back to him saying, I'm really sorry, I'm afraid this is it's another dud, but much more professionally than that. But then he sent me this image and he said, look, I've been to my local auction and I've paid £27 for a box of miscellaneous items, and that is literally how the auctioneer described it. He said there was an antique shop which closed down and they just put everything through auction, but most of it was so awful that it was just boxed up. So I think the portrait was in with things like a lobster jelly mold, and I mean really they'd literally just chucked it into a box. So he sent me an image of this portrait, and I was like, oh, here we go again. But and it was this horrible, moldy thing. But and I see so many miniatures, and I have seen so many miniatures. You know, I've been specialising in them for I think 27 years now. So it takes quite a lot for me to think, oh, hang on a minute, there might be something here, particularly a Victorian miniature, because once photography comes in, you know, they start to become irrelevant, and the quality starts to really go downhill. So this is sort of, you know, around the dawn of photography, this portrait. But I thought, God, that it just looks, there's something about it. So I sent it to Philip, I sent it to my colleague Lawrence, and then sort of started Googling around that date. And then I got an email from this guy who'd sent it to me, saying, look at this. And he'd found the engraving which relates to the portrait. So I was like, oh, right, fine. Here we are then. This is a copy after the engraving, which was engraved for a book. And I thought, but the quality does look really good.
So you could see that even through the kind. Did he wipe away any of the mold off the frame? I mean, what did it look like in the image?
It was. I mean, I don't know if you've seen any images of what it first looked like.
Well, I've got your book here, which you did with Philip Mould. Yes, I've got the fantastic. And of course, here's the image of his face. But yes, listeners can't see it, but there'll be links to purchase this.
Great. Yeah. No, the before and after is probably one of the most extreme makeovers.
It's amazing because the young Dickens is kind of looking out through a fogged up window almost, isn't he, with that with the glass over the...
Yes. In fact, once we realised it could be something exciting, the guy in South Africa was like, so I've taken it apart, and I was like, okay,
yeah, put it on the radiator to dry it out. Yeah.
I thought he was going to say, popped it through the washing machine. Just leave it alone. But he did disassemble it. And actually that was quite helpful. But yeah, I mean, I went to the London Library and I basically sat and flicked through every single biography of Dickens. And whilst this engraving, which clearly related to the portrait, just appeared again and again and again, there was nothing like this portrait miniature. So I then started reading about it, and I came across a website which said the interesting miniature by Miss Margaret Gillies has mysteriously disappeared and is not improbably buried in some private collection. It was exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1844. So I went back to the Royal Academy lists and could see, yes, it was there by this artist called Margaret Gillies, who I hadn't really had very much to do with before, in 1844. So I was beginning to think, oh my goodness, this could be the portrait and it's in South Africa and it's on ivory, which you can't just post from South Africa. So one of the reasons I didn't see it for so long was because trying to persuade the South African authorities to do the correct paperwork to send the portrait over to us was a massive challenge. And we were basically talking to the people who deal with elephant poaching and that sort of thing, and people wanting backhanders. It was yeah, it was an extraordinary journey. I think Dickens would have loved it.
Little bit of a spy novel kind of thing happening here, possibly. Yes.
Yeah, actually, I just remember it being incredibly stressful. But yeah, in fact, we even got it transported overnight to a friend of Philip Mould's in Cape Town, because where it was in Natal, it was just too exposed to. They were threatening to destroy it, and because it was on ivory, and yeah, we just had to get it away from some officials who were threatening that. So yeah.
You say it's on ivory, so in terms of the materials and the component parts of it, which part of it is it? Is it the entire
Yeah,
canvas itself that's ivory based?
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's the support for the watercolors. So all miniatures from the early 18th century are painted on ivory, and that tradition just continues right the way through to the mid 19th century. So it's completely normal and usual. So the early ones are on vellum, like parchment, and then the later ones on ivory.
So obviously, to park the serious morality of using ivory aside for one moment, what was the benefit of using ivory? What was the reason for painting on those?
Well, it's quite difficult to determine, and it wasn't like an artist woke up and had a eureka moment and said, "Why don't we use ivory?" It sort of gradually replaced vellum as a precious material where the surface could never be particularly big, because you've got to work with the size of a tusk.
Yes.
Um, but you see the early miniatures on ivory, and unless you're a specialist, you couldn't tell that there was ivory under the paint. It's very strange. But then later in the sort of 1780s, they start to use ivory, showing through a little bit for sort of skin tones and that sort of thing. But of course, now it's a really demonized material, and quite rightly, there's a massive progress towards, well, a little bit of progress towards stopping the poaching of elephants. But luckily, with the miniatures I deal with, you can tell the age, and yeah, they're not from recent times. But yeah, it's completely normal to use ivory as the support.
Okay, so in our story, in this whole saga for you,
Yes,
the portrait has moved to Cape Town. Is it still covered in mold? If
it is.
persuaded people to stop trying to clean it, stop trying
Yeah,
to do
yeah.
anything helpful?
It did travel to Cape Town in several parts,
Right.
because by now I'd also looked at the frame it was in and recognized that sort of, your listeners will hopefully be able to see images of this rather fancy Victorian metal frame, was one that Margaret Gillies, the artist, had used on other portraits. So I didn't want the owner to throw any component parts away, because it looked as though part of the original frame was also still there.
So that was another clue that it was her. It was her original. Yeah. And the frame itself, I mean, was it quite a standard? You're an artist, you can get a frame like this ready made, and it's quite typical from the 1840s. Or is there anything particularly special about this frame?
No, but it is the sort of fancy frame you would use if you're exhibiting at the Royal Academy,
Right.
and you wouldn't use a plain frame. It's often quite easy to tell which, when you get a miniature in a frame like that, you think the Royal Academy is somewhere you would check the records, because it wouldn't have been a cheap frame, but it would have been. It's not specially made for that miniature, but the other components of the frame would have been. So, but no, this is from a mold.
Right. So when do you get to see it, Emma? When do you actually get to physically hold it
So,
and look at it?
so the email from the owner was October 2017, and it arrived in London in summer 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So, and because it's ivory, we needed to get paperwork so that we could correctly import it into this country. I mean, I was guessing it was ivory because I hadn't actually seen it. In fact, we didn't. We had no idea whether was it potentially a copy. It still could be, because it was so obscured by all this dirt that you just couldn't really tell the quality of it. But I think somebody filmed me unwrapping it summer 2018.
Right.
Yeah, I was such a mix of emotions, but as soon as I saw the real thing, it was actually it's funny how your sense of scale can often be really um confused when you've only seen images of something. And it was really big and bold, and those eyes were still kind of drawing me in.
Yep.
And I could also see that it was definitely by a professional artist, because painting on ivory is not easy. And the quality I could see was there. And amazingly, I could also see that it could be cleaned and conserved back to how it would have originally looked. So it was huge relief once it was finally in London.
Yes, gosh. So you're unwrapping it, and so it has the glass frame over the actual paint surface itself, but had mold got in underneath the glass onto the
Yeah, yeah. Well, the problem with mold on watercolor on ivory is that it eventually will sort of eat the paint itself. So until we got it in front of a conservator and under a microscope, we weren't sure how much of the original painting was left. But it was as though the mold itself respected Mr. Dickens, and the face was completely untouched. It was mainly areas in the jacket that had disintegrated. So the black. Just to be technical, the kind of the gum arabic in the watercolor paint, which made it almost look like oil paint at this period, is very, very, the mold is very attracted to that gum, and the gummier areas were in the thicker paint on his black jacket. So that was the area that was.
Gosh, what a relief! That's great. So essentially, his jacket attracted the mold away from his face.
Yeah.
Wow.
He should always have worn black.
Yes.
Yeah, that seemed to be the case. But amazingly, the face I could see. I mean, even there and then, I could have brushed the mold off the face, and it would have been perfect. So huge relief.
By this point, obviously, you know that it's not a copy or a fake, do you? Or...
I don't know 100% at this point, but by this point, I had been to the Dickens Museum
Yeah.
and spoken to their very knowledgeable curatorial team, and anybody else really who would talk to me about Dickens. So yeah, I contacted living authors who'd written biographies of Dickens. I'd been through archives and letters at the Dickens Museum, where I found the letters between Margaret Gillies, the artist, and Dickens, setting up the sittings for this portrait, and trying to sort of pull it all together. But really, until I unwrapped the portrait, I really didn't know. I mean, my hunch was, from that sort of sucker punch it gave me when I first opened the email, that it was going to be the lost portrait. But you have to have an element of doubt, otherwise you're not really an art historian. You have to really.
Of course, yeah.
You're just an optimist.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
At what moment can you then say this is the real thing? What are the clues you're looking for to definitively say that this is the Gillies portrait from 1843?
So by the time it arrived in London, Margaret Gillies was taught by another artist called Frederick Cruikshank, and I started my career working at the V&A Museum in London, and I had several examples of his work. So I knew his work quite well, and I was able to look at her technique and think, yeah, this is how a Cruikshank pupil would have painted this, and it was really seeing that cemented it. Also, the other thing was, in all my researches, I hadn't found any copies after the engraving in terms of a painted copy. I'd found by then several versions of the engraving, but not any copies after it. And I also found, very excitingly, in the Dickens Museum archive, a letter. There's a chap who's got a really dreadful name. His surname is Kitten. I can't remember his first name, but he must have had a lot of problems getting himself taken seriously. But he was one of Dickens' sort of early biographers, and he wrote to Margaret Gillies, the artist, in the 1880s, when she was a very elderly lady, saying, I'm trying to get together all of the Dickens portraits, and I know you exhibited this one in 1844 in the Royal Academy. Have you still got it? I'd love to illustrate it. And the Dickens archive has a letter from Margaret Gillies in a very shaky hand saying, I've lost sight of it since 1844. I don't know where it is. so I was thinking, okay, so if the artist doesn't know where it is, maybe this is it. Maybe, yeah. We managed to piece together where it might have gone, and in fact, how it might have ended up in South Africa, which was another part of the puzzle.
Yes.
I'm not surprised that she sort of lost sight of it in a way. I think it had its big moment in 1844, just like Dickens did with the success of Christmas Carol. And I think one thing that really, really surprised me about this portrait was how different it was to the image I had of Dickens in my mind. Those photographs of him with his sort of rather revolting beard is how I know Dickens, not like this guy,
Yeah.
who's, yeah, I embarrassed myself on BBC World Service for South Africa by sort of sounding like I'd sort of swiped right on Tinder for him. I
You're
mean,
like a fangirl. Yeah.
yeah, I this portrait made me totally fall in love with him.
Well, I've got it here from your book. I mean, it is extraordinary. There you go. I mean, but what do you see in this image of him? What's it depicting? What are you getting from it?
Well, I mean, aside from the fact that it's not your usual image of Dickens, I think the more I looked into the portrait, the more I got from it. And one of the really exciting things is that because portrait miniatures are smaller than oil portraits, they're much more intimate images. They're usually only meant to be seen by a small group of people, whoever the owner decides to show it to, really. It's not like having a massive oil painting hung on your wall and people come and stand in front of it. A miniature has to be shown by hand. So they're much, much more personal, intimate types of portraits. So, and there are very, very few of Dickens. I think there's one other of him in the Dickens Museum, but he didn't seem to commission portrait miniatures very, very often. So there's a real intimacy in this portrait that you just don't really get in other images. And the idea of Margaret Gillies sitting with Dickens over 6 or 8 sittings in his home and talking to him gives a whole new perspective to the portrait, and I think to the Christmas Carol as well, because Gillies had a very, very interesting background. And one of the reasons I think why Dickens trusted her to paint his portrait in such an intimate technique was that she was shacked up. She was living with someone called Southwood Smith, who was a doctor, and there's no pretty way of putting this, but he was very interested in the sort of sanitary conditions of for people in London. He understood that in poor sanitary conditions, people lived far shorter lives. They contracted many more diseases, and he was a real social reformer, but from a sort of medical point of view. And he was a really good friend of Charles Dickens, who relied on Southwood Smith to really help him understand how he could help people, how Dickens could help people sort of from the ground up. There's no point just giving people money or getting children to Sunday school. They needed better living conditions to be healthier, to therefore be able to work, to therefore be able to get money. And Southwood Smith was brilliant at trying to improve these conditions. And Margaret Gillies didn't marry Southwood Smith. In fact, he remained married while they were living together, because at this period, once you married, everything belonged to your husband. So she didn't want that. She's an early supporter of suffrage for women, and so they're living quite an unconventional life. But they're also working together. So Southwood Smith produces the very first illustrated government report in 1842 to do with conditions in the mines. And apparently I think it was published, some of the images were published in the Times, and there were reports of women fainting when they opened the newspaper. And
Because
Dickens,
the men are naked, aren't they? Working in
yeah,
there completely naked.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah, and young girls as well. So that I think, in terms of the sort of the morality of these sort of bare-breasted teenagers down the mines, was just too much for them to cope with. And Dickens reads it, and he says he broke down and wept when he read the report. But what seems to be true now is that Margaret Gillies actually provided the illustrations for the report. So she's literally at the coalface with her partner, Southwood Smith. And so once you know that, and you know how involved Gillies is in her partner's reform, and and his wanting to reform the sanitary conditions in London, and how important this is to Dickens, that you start to think, okay, so what are they talking about while she's painting this face, and what ideas is she feeding him? Because of course the sittings begin in July and they go through to the end of October, and by then Dickens is writing Christmas Carol. So there's got to be a connection here. This feisty woman artist, she completely understands what Dickens is trying to do. So, and that's an aspect I don't think anybody's really talked about before.
That's so interesting, isn't it? So it's actually an artistic collaboration, isn't it? In his portrayal. I mean, I do think. I mean, looking at in your book, the portrait of William Wordsworth and James
Yeah,
Henry Lee Hunt, they look quite serious and solemn. They don't look like much fun. Whereas his image is very bright, and those enormous wide eyes are so potent, aren't they? And the freshness and the colour in his lips and everything. I mean, it's a very flattering portrayal of him as well.
it
And
is. Yeah.
do you think that's very true to life? Do you think, or do you think there's an element of kind of 1840s filter on him to make him look even better? I don't know. What would you take from that?
Yeah, I would say it is on the idealized side, and certainly the engraving that comes after it is quite idealized as well. But then the engraving was used in a book called A Spirit of the Age, and that was meant to inspire young people to follow the examples of great people from the 1840s. And this was used as the frontispiece. So I think Gillies knew that, and knew the purpose of her portrait was that it was going to be engraved, and wanted him to look really intense and striking. And if he'd looked like a boring old fart, then maybe there's a lot less inspiring. But yeah, I don't know. Dickens himself didn't like the portrait. He comments that he looks rather like the man in the Iron Mask, but with sort of no one in it or something. So I think he found it maybe quite an empty portrait in some ways.
That's
I
really interesting.
Yeah, but you see, he's at such a pivotal moment in his life and career at this point, and Gillies is painting this when Martin Chuzzlewit's been a bit of a flop, and Dickens is really desperate to become a great literary sensation. But it is possible that his next book will also fail in the same way that Chuzzlewit had, in terms of his publishers and his standing as an author. Chuzzlewit was not considered to be a success. But then A Christmas Carol just turns everything around. So she's painting him pre the success of A Christmas Carol. But then when it's exhibited the next year at the Royal Academy, he's the man of the moment. And Christmas Carol sold out, and it's just, so it's really interesting portrait from that perspective. I think if she'd painted him at any other point, the portrait might have had different look to it. But I can see a slight lack of confidence there.
That's interesting. Yes, I can see that, because I think that the wideness of the eyes shows a kind of vulnerability
Yeah.
possibly as well. I feel like his eyes are incredibly wide, actually.
Yes. I think Elizabeth Barrett Browning commented on that. You can see the what is it, the mud and dust of humanity in his eyes. So she saw something very different in it. She saw that it was the portrayal of quite an intense person who was happy to get himself dirty in the when he's trying to help people, as we know he did.
Yeah. Something I like also are the letters that you talk about where Dickens is writing to Margaret Gillies, talking, and he has a cold, doesn't he, at one point,
Yeah.
and so he has to delay having a sitting. But he makes a suggestion that Maclise, the artist Maclise, goes with him, which I thought was very interesting. I'm wondering whether that's Dickens trying to control the situation. But I've just got another artist. Do you don't mind if he comes and observes you?
Yeah.
You think,
don't mind him.
Yeah, that's a bit interesting, isn't it? I mean, maybe it's totally innocent. Maybe it's completely convivial. But I find that if I was a painter and they said, oh, you don't mind if my other very famous painter comes who happened to do the 1839 portrait along, that famous one you've
Which I love. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's very good, isn't it? Yeah.
No, I found that very interesting as well. And of course, she wouldn't have been able to say no. I don't think Dickens heard no very often. But yes, the idea of Maclise kind of hovering over her shoulder must have been really awful.
Yes. So you have it in your possession. The mold is removed. You've got the conservators looking at it saying, no, we can get his face cleaned up and everything. What's the next stage, Emma? Because it does eventually end up at his house in Doughty Street at the Charles Dickens Museum, doesn't it?
Which makes me so happy. And
yes.
I was watching a television program last Christmas about Dickens and Dickens at Christmas. It was a new program, and they included the portrait in that program, and it was really, I think Lucinda Hawksley's holding it, but it's just so lovely that it's now sort of fully integrated into the other items at Doughty Street, and it's just fantastic. But yeah, mold is off, and we are and then we launched the portrait in November of that year. And it was just such an amazing evening, revealing the portrait to the public, and the response was just incredible. I mean, I've never. I think there was one point where Philip Mould was outside in a BBC van doing an interview for Radio 4, and I was doing sort of world service in the basement, and then we were whisked off to do all sorts of things. So it was just really, really exciting being able to finally talk about it. And it was Christmas time, and I took myself to the Old Vic to see Christmas Carol.
Christmas Carol, yes. Yeah.
It was just lovely sitting there thinking, I really know this man now, and seeing the play acted out just had a whole new meaning. It was just and knowing all the background, everything that was going on with Margaret Gillies and Southwood Smith, and it was just so revelatory, really. And then the particular excitement from the curators at the Dickens Museum, who'd been so helpful all along, was just wonderful. But yeah, we were determined, and the Dickens Museum were determined to get it into the house. So launching the portrait in November was also the start of launching the appeal, financial appeal for them to buy it. So I've heard lots of people talk about Dickens and how, whenever you meet him in your life, whenever you first read something by him, that's it, you're hooked, you're reeled in. And I am now totally, as you say, a fangirl.
And do you go back to visit the portrait at all often?
Yes. Yeah, I do. And I love going to that house. And it gives me such a thrill to see it in situ. And it's right near his writing desk. So it's just perfect in the house. It couldn't be in a better place.
Yeah, quite right. I was going to ask, Emma, so this portrait, this whole Charles Dickens portrait represents one thing of the many projects you've worked on, and something that I was very struck by was something relating to King Henry III of France. That's another discovery you've made. What?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with miniatures is they do literally get shut in drawers for centuries, and unlike paintings, they can be literally hidden. So I'm really lucky in my career that I've had some discoveries, and the one of Henry III of France was one of them. I mean, I would say Dickens probably career highlight. I'm unlikely to be able to to replicate that anytime soon. But in lockdown, I saw a portrait coming up at an auction in, I think it was Sussex, and I knew that it was the 16th century portrait, and I knew it was of Henry III of France because I had been working on him, another portrait of him by an English artist. So I said to Philip, look, we need to buy this. He said, okay, you've got a budget of 10 grand, but because it was lockdown, I couldn't go and see it, and I had to bid online. So I got myself all set up and thought, oh, I really hope we get it. And, was getting more and more excited about it. And of course, I'm in the middle of bidding and my computer just froze.
Oh.
So I know you could not make it up. And my teenager, who was obviously, homeschool at the time, online learning and whatever, I was like, help. She came over.
Pulled her out of geography or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Forget geography. I'd still, to this day, don't know what she did. But anyway, she got me back online with this poor singular auctioneer on his own, and locked down and with his gavel. And we got the final bid just as I got back online. I just pressed bid. So yeah, then it got sent to us and I had a look at it and it had a little bit of damage. So I sent it to a conservator and he opened it up and it was signed on the back, which it was just amazing. And it was signed by Jean Decour, who was Mary Queen of Scots artist. But it was the only work ever discovered to be signed by this artist. So suddenly we have an absolute rock solid, definite example of his work. And it was dated 1578. So it was just a gift hiding in the back of this miniature. But then all the press were interested in was the fact that Henry III was a cross-dresser and had...
And was assassinated, I think, wasn't he, as well?
And assassinated, yeah. That was the end of the Valois dynasty. But and pretty much universally hated in his own time and later as well, which is probably why it was a portrait which nobody wanted to get out. So, but yeah, great for us. And he was great fun to research because he was such a character. Apparently you knew where he had been at court because he wore so much perfume that it would sort of linger after, like, hours after he'd left. And he surrounded himself by very beautiful young men. But yeah, that's amazing discovery. And that is now a portrait which has gone to a museum in America. So where they have some ceramics by the Decor workshop. So it works brilliantly there. So yes, that was very exciting.
Gosh. And in the last year or 2 years, you've set up the Limner company, your own.
The Limner company, yes. Limner being the word that was used to describe the profession of early miniaturists. So it comes from the word illumination, and miniatures come from illuminated manuscript tradition. So limnings was the word to describe a portrait miniature in the 16th, 17th century, and the people who painted them were called limners. So we are the Limner company.
Wow.
Yeah.
And are there projects coming in that you absolutely can't tell me about?
Yes.
Good. That's exciting anyway. And was there a key moment in your life where it suddenly became about miniature portraits for you?
Probably really early, actually. I think my parents took me to Hever Castle when I was about 10, and they had a miniature of Anne Boleyn. And I don't know whether it was just some fake copy or whatever, but I looked at it and I thought, oh my God, Henry VIII held that. And it was that sort of idea of an object that was handheld and loved, and you looked at the portrait miniature in your hand and you felt emotion that I think, I love oil paintings. Obviously, I'm an art historian, but there's something about miniatures that just breaks down the barriers in a way that other portraiture just doesn't do, which I think is why this portrait of Dickens is so exciting. Because I think the barriers between artist and sitter there, and as you called it, sort of collaboration, was very different to the experience that Dickens would have had with Maclise or any other artists or photographers. There's an intensity there that is just missing in oil paintings.
Wow. Gosh, Emma, it's been so wonderful to spend time talking to you about this. Thank you ever so much. Are you all set up for Christmas now? Are you ready? Or have you got lots of last minute flurries?
I'm back to Paris next Wednesday. So yeah, I'm going to come back on the Eurostar with a lot of smelly cheese, probably. It's a work trip, but yeah, I'm definitely ready for the break.
Oh, well, on that note, thank you so much again. It's been wonderful talking to you. And people listening, there is a link to Emma's website where you can purchase her publications and find out more about the Limner Company. And I wish you a very Merry Christmas. Thank you so much again.
You too. Thanks, Dominic.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.